Hi, I'm the True Wise Gamer, giving up my vast knowledge so you may understand games a bit better. When you really think about it, the Castlevania series has had a weird history. By that I mean, when you really think about it, Castlevania as a series is both well known but unknown at the same time. Like, sure, a lot of people know about the basic series on the NES and the Super Nintendo, and most famously, Symphony of the Night. But once you go beyond that game, really there's kinda like a gap for people. Not to say that there wasn't anything good there was, I'm just saying like, a lot of people contextualize the series that way. You know what I mean? And mind you, that was many years of the series, where a lot of the great games came out. And after a certain point, the series stopped making games in general. It wasn't until the Castlevania show came out that the series actually had some vitalization again. Though that would imply that new games would be made. Sadly, they would just be ports, which from what I've been told are actually really put a lot of effort into basically building them up from the ground up. Which is really neat if anything. In fact, the only games that haven't been ported yet are Harmony of Despair, which was actually that multiplayer game that a friend of mine actually covered, and is really well regarded, and I think you should watch their video on it to learn more about it. But in any case, there was also the Judgment game, which I don't know anyone who likes it, but whatever. The N64 game, the Legacy of Darkness version, because it's the better one of the two, and the PS2 games. And who knows when those can be ported, but hey, stranger things have happened. However, before the long pause of nothing really happening with the series, there was a reboot, which is today's discussion. However, before we talk about it, we need to go back a bit and talk about another game in the series. That being the PS2 game duology, Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness. You see, these games were actually made to try to branch the series out, try to see what it could do in 3D. However, they sold poorly. Okay, just to kind of side note for a moment, skip to this moment if you want to hear more of the development. And if you don't want to hear that, go to this part to start the review. Okay, to begin the side note begins with me just saying, I actually covered these two games, but the review for it is actually pretty bad. I agree with my general thoughts with it still, but overall the audio quality is still garbage, and, well, I say I agree with it. On a general sense I agree with it, but on a more visceral sense I don't. Like, I don't think these games are all that great, but they're not as bad as I was making them out to be. They're pretty mediocre. They're fine for what they are. I think they go on a little too long for what they want to do. Other than that, they're fine. And you might be now wondering why we're even talking about these two games. Well, for all intents and purposes, they failed horribly and kind of forced the series to stay on handhelds. Which, to note, again, this is where a bunch of the games of the series are made for, and are designed really well, at least what a friend of mine told me, because I haven't touched them yet. The series has always been that thing where I want to try it, but I'm like, not now, you know what I mean? It's in the list. Anyway, while these games are really good, well, you can only do so much before the series starts to decline a bit, being the same old. And not in that sense of, oh, they gotta do the same thing over and over again? When are they gonna innovate? More like in that sense of, well, they keep releasing the games year after year after year, where it floods the market. You know what I mean? Thus, Konami decided at the time to try to expand the series by trying to reboot it. They basically let dev teams try to pitch out the idea to someone. They landed with Mercury Steam, a dev team that has a shoddy beginning, if anything, only shoddy in the general sense because, well, they made the Clive Barker Jericho game that basically anyone I've ever heard talk about it says it's really bad, and American McGee Scraplands, which I have no idea, I've never heard of it until now, but I've heard it's pretty good from one of my friends. Got remastered too. However, there would be more later known for the Metroid Samus Returns and Metroid Dread, which are really good games, again from a friend of mine. I have never touched those games. This is gonna sound really weird, again I have a bucket list, they just weren't my top priority. Anyway, Konami liked their pitch and decided to go with them. However, somewhere during development they decided to go like, okay, can you actually make it not Castlevania? And they almost scrapped the entire idea soon enough, It wasn't until Dave Cox actually showed it all to senior Japan management of Konami, which actually caught the eye of Kojima. Yeah, the Kojima. Before Konami burned the bridge with him, but in any case, he was still good with Konami at the time and basically was able to convince them that, hey, this could be a good idea for the reboot. And so they basically said, hey, make the reboot again. And so they begun. Kojima would actually have a few parts in this thing, though, for the record, I won't reference it, but he was involved. Not too much, but more in that sense of ideas. You know what I mean? But in any case, and while the game was being developed, there was a general sense of hype for the game. Hell, when the game came out, the game sold really well. In fact, it's the best-selling Castlevania game of all time. Which is really sad if anything, but And that really made me curious at the time, because I didn't know this at the time. So I wondered what made this game sell so well, what made it so critically acclaimed at the time. So, this is why I'm doing the review, and it's also Halloween. So why not? So let us begin this review for Castlevania, Lords of Shadows. The game begins with our main character, Gabriel Belmont, who's on his way to the nearby lake that is being attacked by monsters that has been ravaging the land for a long time. After handling them, he heads to the lake to meet the old god, Pan, who guards the lake and asks Gabe what the hell he wants. And Gabe explains, yes, I'm gonna call him Gabe because I don't know why that's funnier to me. Anyway, Gabe explains that heaven's all out of whack. Okay, let's actually elaborate on this. So, Gabe is a part of a group called the Order of Light that handles monsters all for the sake of God. And they mean that in a literal sense, as heaven and hell are real here. Though, what does that make Pan? I mean, like, I know he's an old god, but there's like those two, unless they're going for the Paradise Lost angle where the old gods are actually fallen angels, but actually that could be the way they're explaining it. You know what, never mind, not important. It has also, however, caused people who have died not be able to ascend to heaven, which includes Marie, Gabe's old wife, who died recently. Gabriel is also having dreams about her, so the Order believes that basically, if they contact Maria, they can figure out what the hell is going on. Pan agrees to it, but not after a weird scene. I'm not entirely sure why it's here. Anyway. And when he's able to meet her after a boss fight, we'll talk about it. I swear on my life we'll talk about it, oh god. She mentions something about the Lords of Shadows and the prophecy. She then disappears as we soon meet Sobek. Huh. Anyway, he's here to also try to figure out what's going on. And once he hears about the Lord of Shadows, he figures that this is the sign to finally actually try to defeat the Lord of Shadows, which are ancient powerful beings that have been around for a long time and may have begun actually striking out and trying to take over the world, and that by defeating them they believe they can re-establish their connection. And so, Gabe and Sobek begin their journey to begin and hunt down the Lords of Shadows. And after a bit, Gabe finds the Lord of Shadow of the Lycans, which he actually elaborates that the Lord of Shadows are actually the dark side of the founders of the Order of Light. Which, I'm gonna just pull out my theology card and call nonsense, because if I've learned anything about Christianity and all that jazz, it's that it has a very no-nonsense binary system. You're either good or evil. There's no, like, in-between. I mean, like, if they just said that, like, these guys are just the remaining sin in them, and all that jazz, I think that could work, but that's just me. In any case, soon enough you are able to defeat all of the Lords of Shadows. However, this is where the reveal happens and we suddenly learn that, oh wait, I gotta pull on my shock face, that Sobek was evil the entire time. Le shock. For real talk here, I think the moment that we see him in the journal and talking about everything that's going on was just basically like, yeah, he's evil. He actually explained that he is the final Lord of Shadows, that's actually been planning this out the entire time, using Gabe as his tool. In fact, Sobek's the one who made Gabriel kill his wife, and all that shit. But why do all this? Well, simply put, he wanted to grab their piece of the Mask of God, which is supposed to give someone a lot of power, and is kind of why Gabriel wanted to do this entire journey, because It was also rumored that the mask could also revive the dead, so Gabriel thought he could revive his wife. However, this is an error, and now Sobek has the mask and is prepared to destroy Gabriel. However, before he is able to put on the mask, he is then taunted by a voice and is then quickly burned to a crisp. And then suddenly pops out, and I can't joke to you about this, Satan. No nonsense, just Satan. He returns all like, Deus Vult and all that jazz and says, Satan, stop that. Come on, man. And Satan's all like, no, screw you, I want to do my thing. And Gabriel's like, no. And it honestly is a cool fight, by the way. It's just that I kind of messed it up a bit because I didn't understand how it was supposed to work. We'll talk about that a little more, but not now. Let's finish up this story for a moment. Anyway, after beating Satan, he talks to Maria one last time and says that this whole journey was a journey to make sure that he can forgive himself and try to become a better person. As the game closes on Gabriel being all alone, who must now continue his journey to fight evil. Well, sorta. We'll talk about that in a moment. You might have noticed that I kinda quickly went through the plot, but that was actually on purpose. Mostly because, well, this plot is really simple. In fact, weirdly enough, the simplicity actually also reminded me of one of the PS2 games, Lament of Innocence. In fact, when I was rereading my script for Lament of Innocence, I then realized that these two plots are way too similar to one another. I mean, really think about it. A Belmont goes on a journey to rescue their beloved and learn the way to free them is to defeat very powerful beings in order to do so. However, it turns out the real villain was someone who was mentioned a few times, and only a few times, but never mentioned in the direct sense, if that makes sense. And we then soon defeat them, sort of. However, they are unable to reunite with the one person they want to see the most, and must continue on their journey to defeat evil, now alone. Again, sort of. The connection is more of a overarching thing than a straight one-to-one. I'm just noting it just for my own sake, rather than actually making a meaningful saying something about it. You know what I mean? And you might have now noticed that I haven't really talked about the plot, and well, that's essentially because I already have. That explanation of the plot is just what happens. There's nothing really more than I'm just leaving out. In fact, for the most part, I feel like adding any more to it just overcomplicates the story that is already there. Sure, I can bring up this girl and the knight, but I'm like, do I really need to? They're not unimportant, but they're not meaningful to the overarching narrative, maybe to a thematical point, but in a structural sense, no. And usually I wouldn't be harping on this much, but it feels like it wants me to care way more than I am, but I'm sadly I just don't. It's not like I don't care, but it's more like that sense of mild curiosity than actual engagement. I think it's a problem because of how the story is presented. I don't know how else to provide what I'm talking about. The story is presented in this epic sense. I have no other word to use than epic, which is trying to be what it tried to feel like. And at times it's able to present it like that, but in a narrative sense, not really. Cause sure, you can have all these epic moments here and there, but if there's no low toe to ground moments of humanity, all these epic moments don't really mean anything to me, you know what I mean? And that's really the thing I want to say about this game in a nutshell. This game is trying to be epic, and sadly for the most part, when it tries to do it, it does somewhat succeed, but not always to the extent that I think the game wants it to feel like. And I want to really stress here that I don't think the story is bad, not at all, it's fine. It just feels like I'm seeing the bones of it rather than the whole body, you know what I mean? I'm waiting for the story to give me more to chew on, but for whatever reason, the game has a bad habit of kinda sidelining it for a little bit to do this side stuff, to try to also have more epic moments in it. This is where I need to talk about the game's structure, as it's structured in a chapter base, with 10 chapters in all. However, not every chapter is equal in content. where sometimes a few chapters are taking place in this one area, but it's varied and diverse, and sometimes it's just a straight shot through it. However, I will argue throughout the entire game, there are a lot of moments that I think could have been utterly removed and would have helped with the game's overall feel, for lack of a better term. Like, I don't like using the word pacing because that term has a lot of connotations to it because they don't actually elaborate on that sort of vibe. Like, what's breaking the pace? Like, do you mean as in like the narrative structure, the gameplay structure? Because those are two separate things, and to try to congeal them into one thing is not always a good idea. But I'm getting off topic. In a narrative sense, I do believe they kind of break whatever sort of flow the game's having. Because usually the game is usually good enough to go from one point to another, but then sometimes it will just stop to do whatever it wants to do this side thing that really does not add to the plot. Like, you go to this castle of this witch that has nothing to do with anything. She's not particularly stopping you, and like, removing this entire section harms nothing. It also doesn't help that it has a section in the game that I have never met anyone who's ever liked it, but we'll talk about that later. And in some regard, I get it. They want to have more sections of gameplay, but at the same time, it's like, do I really have to do this section though? And that just keeps popping up and up. But let's actually begin talking about the gameplay, where I'm like, This is where I want to bring up something that I haven't mentioned before, but it's more important to talk about it here. You see, a lot of the reviews around this game kind of call this game kind of like a God of War butt, and it's like, while there are similarities, they are only ever skin deep. And really, there are fundamental differences between the two that make them very different to each other. So, let's actually talk about it. The combat can be simplified as through this. You have a basic attack and a wide hitting attack that can be combined to make combo. Though, more times than not, you won't ever be using the wide hitting moves, mostly because the damage dealt by it is so weak, you might as well not bother. Sounds simple enough, and it really is. It's what you combine it with other things that the differences become more noticeable. Because unlike God of War, which focus heavily on offense, Lords of Shadows focus more on the defensive aspect. That's mostly because Gabriel, as much as he's a strong human, he's still human and needs to be careful. Thus brings us into one of the mechanics that brings this idea into focus. God damn it, this was not intentional. That being the focus gauge. This gauge basically builds up over time as you deal attacks, dodge, or counter. And as it builds up and once it's fully charged, once you hit a foe, they drop energy orbs, which can be absorbed into either your shadow or light magic, which basically allows you to enter shadow and light form, which have different bonuses to them. Light form gets you more health as you attack, while shadow form deals more damage with each attack. Though to note, light form is just better overall because you can heal more. That's just always better than more damage. But the point being is, it's supposed to make sure that you are staying on top of yourself and making sure that you aren't going crazy, and it's all about those great moments of counteracting and basically doing the damage. And like with the story, it tries to be really epic, and if I can be honest, it really does a good job at times. Like, when we're talking about the normal bosses, they're actually pretty good. Like, I actually think most of the bosses are fine. It's just that when you're facing against these types of bosses, I'm like, no. This is where we need to talk about the Titans. These guys are like the most boring fights in the entire game. Like, I know they're trying to be awesome, big battles, but it's like, it's not that interesting, and it's more or less waiting around to do something than actually doing it, which is really annoying. It's not helped that they also all play the same, where you're basically trying to get on top of them and climb them to actually fight them, which is just boring as shit. And the final one is just the worst. It's just annoying. It's this long, tedious platforming. And it's not interesting, because we need to talk about this now too. While the gameplay has a good combat focus, it's also platform focused as well, with some puzzles here and there. And actually, if I could dissect the amount of time you're dealing with each section, I would separate it into this. Around 40% of the game is combat, 40% of the game is platforming, and the 20% are puzzles. Though to say that, I need to actually diverge more deeply into that, because the platforming is a little off, because you can separate that platforming into two styles of platforming. You will have actual platforming where you need to actually maneuver yourself well into platforming, and the vast majority of platforming of the game, that being uncharted platforming. This is a term I don't know if we actually have a term for it, where basically all it serves is to show off the vistas of the game. Basically, it's meant to show off the scale and all that jazz, show the epicness of it all. Which, to note, if there's anything I could praise about this game, it's the look of it. It looks great, even now. There's a lot of details in everything, and it's really well done. Like, if I could praise anything, I really cannot stop praising the art direction of this game. And I only have a problem with the Uncharted platforming is because it's dead gameplay. Like, I know you want to show off all this, but you can tone it down a bit, you know what I mean? I mean, for goodness sakes, there's a reason why there's a fixed camera angle. And like, just a side note for a moment, the fixed camera is not an issue in gameplay. Not really, only in a few places, but only in a few places. Like, I could only name a few, like, off the top of my head. Like when you're platforming and then suddenly the camera changes for a moment before you can actually see what it wants you to focus on. That gets annoying. Like, it should be more subtly changing as you're going down, but I'm getting off topic. My point is, I just don't find Uncharted platforming all that interesting. I again repeat, I get what it's trying to do, but it's not helped that it's not that interesting. And I also had to talk about the soundtrack here too, because I'm gonna be apologizing. I don't think it's bad, but I don't care for it. And it's a pure me thing. Like, orchestral soundtracks have a problem with me because more times than not, they kind of all blend into each other. And this ties into my problem again of the game trying to be really epic, but it can't scale it right. Where basically it has no low point, where it all sounds like this bombastic, big stuff. You know what I mean? And all the time I just felt like, oh, I'm just hearing the same song over and over again, when I'm really not. There are very differences between them. They just sound so similar to me. I'm sorry, it's just how I am. So it kind of created this repetitive nonsense in my head where I'm like, I just want this to be done. And I finally want to talk about the puzzles, because this is where I need to feel like I need to say something about them. 10% of them are just normal puzzles that I actually think are well designed, well crafted, and really well done. But there are types of puzzles that I'm like, these aren't puzzles, these are just do the thing. Where basically you're asked to do something that, like, you could just look at it and say, oh, I just gotta do that. You know what I mean? And that sort of sucks because, again, I really want to say here that I think the puzzles, when they are actual puzzles, are really interesting and well designed. Though, if I'm being honest, if there's one thing I could complain about the puzzles, it's, well, that I feel as though the game doesn't have enough variety in their puzzles, where it feels like they could have done more with them to make them more interesting. And I feel like the relics are a good example of what I'm talking about. Yeah, you see, I didn't really mention these mostly because, well, it's better off to talk about them here than anywhere else, because here's the thing. Relics are something you gain over time and abilities that allow you to do more stuff. In a combat sense, they don't really work that well because they take a little too long for my liking to be useful in combat, so I didn't bother with them. I also forgot about sub-weapons, which I don't know why every version of this script I keep forgetting about them, and that's mostly because they're not that useful in combat. Like, they're not unuseful, but they're not, like, my top priority. Like, the firebomb is all good and all, but everything else is like, eh. You can summon anima for some reason. Gonna have to censor that, but yeah, that's kinda cool. But in any case, I felt like the game could have used these more to incentivize more interesting puzzles, but more times than not, they're just there to find hidden upgrades, which you could find throughout the entire game, which also is nice when you can also backtrack to any level you like. So if you like one level, you could play it again without having to play the entire game, which is really nice. And that's really what they're only used for, which is really sad because I thought these could have been used for more puzzles. But more times than not, they're just there for minor platforming or minor puzzles that doesn't use the puzzle to its full extent and might just leave something out. And what I mean by that is, sometimes the puzzle will ask you to do something in particular, but for whatever reason, sometimes it won't tell you what to do. Like, there's this one puzzle where you need to go into shadow mode, throw a knife to unlock something, which the game has never told you this has ever been a thing you could ever do. I just had to learn this on my own. And it's like, but why though? It's a minor habit that keeps popping up every so often, like with these guys, where you can't hit them normally unless you're in shadow mode, then you can hit them. Again, the game doesn't tell you can do that, so I didn't even bother and just ran past them. I'm sorry for that minor tangent, but my point being is still, I don't feel like the game has enough to do. And that finally brings us to the runtime. From most of the reviews and from everyone I have understood, this game is around 20 hours if you're trying to do a lot, which I did not. But my point is, I feel like the 20-hour mark just overall hampers the game, and it's what I was trying to reference earlier. That while this game is fine, it's overall just a little too long for what I would have preferred. Basically, it has a story, it tells it in a mediocre sense, and I feel like if it didn't have so much padding between each moment, I feel like I would have enjoyed the game way more than I would have. Because at the end of the day, I think this game is kind of just mediocre. When it tries to hit the heights, it really does at times, but when it doesn't, it just feels like, whatever, man. And that really sucks. You might have now noticed also that I'm kind of wrapping this up, but we're not done yet, because we need to talk about the DLC and the ending. Well, we need to talk about the ending for then the DLC, okay? So, let's actually talk about this. Because you see, that's not the ending, because it didn't just end with Gabriel just leaving, no. The game then flash forwards a bit to show us that Sobek's alive and meeting up with someone, being Gabriel, who's now Dracula. That is an interesting way to end the game and kind of good way to tease the next game. And I kind of was intrigued on how the hell they were going to play this out. Then the DLC happened. And well, they don't really give a good explanation. The DLC is basically, Gabriel finds out about a demon called the Forgotten One, which is another Lament of Innocence reference, which is really weird. Again, I could keep throwing out more references, but I'm not gonna do that. Anyway, basically, he's super strong, but however, for Gabriel to get there, he needs to be turned into a creature of the night. And basically, he met this one kid, Laura. I don't care about Laura, she doesn't really matter. Basically kills her and becomes a vampire, which he then uses the power of the vampire to destroy the Forgotten One with all the other powers he's gained. And after that, he basically denounces everything and just leaves. That's just how the DLC ends. And you might have noticed, this isn't my footage. That's mostly because I could not be bothered to play the game more. I was like, done. I had my fill, and I felt like if I played any more, I felt genuinely, I would just be trashing the game more. And I really don't want to do that. Because, let's be clear about this. Lords of Shadows is a fine game. Is it one of the best games ever made? No. Is it bad? I really have a hard time saying so. I mean, like, after playing White Knight Chronicles, I swear on my life, I have to really rethink about how I looked at games now. Because, holy shit, that game sucked. And I think it made me more appreciative of this game, where it didn't feel like it was wasting my time all that much. It still does, but, you know what? It's not that bad, or even that egregious. Like, it wanted to be this big epic that was just grand to see and make sure that it's remembered for all time. I'll remember it, but not everything was worth remembering. At the end of the day, Lords of Shadows can be described as a failed epic. An epic that is really genuinely trying, and when it does succeed, it succeeds well, but there's just not enough for me to enjoy it. I think the story was fine but mediocre, the gameplay was also mediocre and fine, but I don't feel like the everything else was holding it up. And really, the only thing that was helping it was the graphics, and even then, I'm like, cool. Is that all you got? And that's really how the game really is. That's all it's got. Next year, I hope to talk about, well, Mirror of Fate, how I actually got introduced to this sub-series. But that can be handled next year. Because next time, we're going to cover another vampire series. Because, well, today we covered the ascension of Dracula. Let's talk about his son. No, not that one, the other one.